welcome back History 1302 to another lecture here in class. And today the topic that we'll be covering is that of the early years of the Cold War. Now when we were in class last time, we finished up our discussion over the Second World War. We saw the United States as well as their allies defeated both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan within that conflict. However, with the end of World War II, this does not mean that peace and prosperity would be restored to the world. We will see that the former Allied powers, namely the United States versus the Soviet Union, because of ideological differences that they have, they're going to begin to divide and eventually find themselves as common enemies in this years after the Second World War. Now, what's going to divide them, as I mentioned a moment ago, will be their ideological differences, because the governments that we see out in the West, where we see Great Britain and the United States, are going to look vastly different than the governments and the economies that we see out in the East with the Soviet Union and those communist nations. Now, first taking a look at the East, out in the Soviet Union, what we'd see practice is a form of totalitarian communism. Now, this form of totalitarian communism, as we'll see within the Soviet Union, they would adopt a communist system to where they attempt to create a classless society. However, by doing so, we will see that they will outlaw all other political parties and basically impose a dictatorship to crush out any sort of opposition to their regime. And we'll see even many of the other governments who will adopt the system would adopt a similar government to the Soviets. On the other side of the aisle, we'll see that the United States, as well as many of the Western nations, are going to practice what is known as have a democratic capitalistic system. Here they would be allowed to elect their governments, have a number of political factions, and their economic system would be based around capitalism, around free markets, to where there wasn't this classless society of like what we see try to be developed out in these communist countries. But anyways, these former allies, even before World War II, they were beginning to butt heads, but now that they no longer have a common enemy, in the days after World War II, we'll see that tensions will begin to once again heighten between them and eventually lead the world to perhaps World War III. Now, as we dive into this period, let's start talking about how these two powers are beginning to break apart. And to understand this, we need to understand Soviet aggression following the Second World War. And so now let's take a look at where this aggression began to develop and where we see these Allied powers begin to break apart. Now, almost immediately after the end of World War II, we see tensions begin to emerge between the former Allied powers. And when we start to see these tensions really begin to boil over, we'll begin with the Potsdam Conference. Now, there had been a conference held at Yalta prior to the end of World War II to where the big three Allied powers, that of the United States, Great Britain, as well as the Soviet Union, agreed to divide up Europe and allow the people of Europe to decide whether or not they'd become a democratic, a communist, a socialist, or any kind of state following the war. However, by the time we get to July of 1945, just a couple of months after Germany officially surrenders, the Soviets, they have not left those countries that they had liberated from the Nazis. We see that Soviet troops continue to occupy many Eastern European countries, and they were beginning to look to impose new communist regimes within those countries. As a result, the Allied powers would be a bit outraged, and they would try to resolve this issue at the Potsdam Conference. However, even though the Allied powers are going to voice their concerns with Joseph Stalin, he's not going to listen to them. The reason he wants to keep Soviet troops within these Eastern European countries is because he wants to create a buffer zone, so that way it could protect the Soviet Union from invasion, whether it be from Germany, but more notably as we get into the Cold War, from the West. And here tensions are only going to continue to mount. And once World War II officially ends with the surrender of Japan by September, we will start to see that both the Soviets as well as the United States, their relationship is going to greatly cool. And moving into 1946, we'll see that Joseph Stalin will begin to issue a series of threats stating that basically these two powers could not peacefully coexist with one another, and eventually this would lead us off to war again. And it will be in this atmosphere that we'll see the U.S. will begin to create a policy that will shape America's foreign policy in regards to the advance of communism for years to come. Now, by February of 1946, Joseph Stalin has already made it clear that he believes that communists as well as the capitalist West could not peacefully coexist with one another. And it will be in the midst of this atmosphere that in that same month, February of 1946, we'll see that an American ambassador over in the Soviet Union, one George Kennan, is going to send back to the United States what has become known as his long telegram. Basically, he would be dictating to the U.S. that through the Marxist-Leninist system that you see in Russia, that they were not intent on remaining or keeping the peace. And as a result of that, he's going to call for the creation of a new foreign policy that the U.S. must adopt in order to stop Soviet expansionism. And this is where he would establish what would eventually become known as the policy of containment. Now, the policy of containment is very simple to understand. Moving forward, once the U.S. has officially adopted this policy, they would look to contain communism in the territories in which it already exists. It wants to ensure that communism does not spread to other countries. And we'll see that the U.S. at times is going to use either diplomatic, economic, or military aid to various countries to ensure that communism does not spread. And we'll see that it will dominate American foreign policies for almost the next 50 years during the duration of the Cold War. Now, when this was initially proposed to the U.S., we'll see that the Truman administration isn't going to formally adopt it until the following year, when we see the publication of the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine will be adopted by the United States within March of 1947, and it's going to formally adopt this policy of containment. Now, what happens to lead to the publication of this doctrine is we'll see that a couple of Western European countries, or I should say really Western allied countries, that of Greece as well as Turkey, we'll see that the British are going to withdraw aid from those countries. By doing so, there's a possibility that there could be a communist uprising within those states to take over those countries. Therefore, once Britain pulls out, the United States is then going to begin to provide mainly diplomatic and economic aid to those countries to ensure that communism did not take over those nations. The main reason for this is because, according to the Truman Doctrine, we'll see there would be another theory that would be coined that would also dominate Cold War policies. If they did not save these communist countries, the belief was that if you allowed, say, Greece or Turkey to fall to communism, this would lead to what's called the domino theory. It would lead to other European powers falling into communism, and quite literally, with more radical thinkers in regards to this theory, it could lead to a world takeover with communism. And so to ensure that this domino theory didn't go into effect, by publishing the Truman Doctrine, we see that the administration formally adopts containment to avoid that policy. But over time, we will see that this will get the U.S. into a lot of trouble. But while Greece and Turkey were coming under the threat of falling to communism, we'll see other Western European countries by 1947 and 1948 also were coming under the threat of falling to communism. And this is where we'll see the Secretary of State under Harry Truman, that of George Marshall, propose what would be dubbed his Marshall Plan. Now, through the Marshall Plan, what George Marshall is going to propose in 1947 is the U.S. needs to provide economic aid to most of the Western European nations that we see out in Western Europe. The reason being is because they had been torn by World War II, and many nations like Italy, France, and Belgium, they were struggling to cope with the post-war world since their countries were in ruins. And he thus calls on the United States to provide at least $14 billion in aid to these countries so that way they wouldn't fall to communism. Now, the reason that's going to lead to the scare for him to propose this plan is we do start to see the expansion of socialist movements within those countries. Now, while they may not have been under serious threat of a communist takeover, nonetheless, as a part of this policy of containment, the U.S. needed to revive those countries to ensure that communism did not spread. However, many Americans were very reluctant to support Marshall's Plan because this would call for $14 billion to be sent overseas. And why does that matter? Well, it's because all this money is going to come from American taxpayers, and Americans weren't willing to pay that tax in order to fund the reconstruction of Europe. However, with the fall of Czechoslovakia to communism in early 1948, Congress would support the Marshall Plan, and we'll see that American aid would begin to be sent over to a variety of European countries, including one of which that had been divided up after the end of World War II. We will see some of this money would arrive in West Germany. Now, some of the aid of the Marshall Plan will find its way to West Germany. Now, really quick before I talk about what's going to occur in West Germany, is we do see that at the end of World War II, as a part of the two conferences that I mentioned earlier, we do see that Germany is going to be divided up into 4 sectors between the 4 major Allied powers. However, by the time we get to 1948 and 1949, we'll see that the Soviet sector would officially become known as East Germany, and the other 3 sectors that were under the control of the United States, Great Britain, as well as France, would become known as West Germany. And some of the funding of the Marshall Plan will go to West Germany as well as West Berlin. Now, Berlin itself, the German capital was located deep within the Soviet sector. And just like the rest of Germany, it had been divided up as a result of the end of the war. However, we do see that once West Germany is united, same thing would be the case for the West Berlin provinces. And once these West Berlin sectors were united, we'll see that they would benefit from the Marshall Plan. However, the Soviets, on the other hand, and the Eastern German sector have no interest of reconstructing German society. And with this, we do start to see tensions begin to develop over West Berlin, mainly because it was this symbol, I should say this bright symbol in the middle of all this suckiness that we see out in East Germany as a result of the end of the war. Now, Joseph Stalin, by this point, growing frustrated that West Berlin was beginning to recover from the effects of the war, he's going to call on a blockade of the city by 1948. And officially, there will be a blockade put against Berlin. We'll see that all traffic going from West Germany into West Berlin would be cut off, and the city would be facing starvation. However, in the midst of this, we'll see the Allied powers, or I should say the Western powers, would come up with a plan to ensure that West Berlin would not fall to the communists. To avoid war, they're going to use their air power to fly in supplies into the city so that way the city would survive throughout the course of the next year. This would be known as the Berlin Crisis, the Berlin Blockade, as well as the Berlin Airlift. And by May of 1949, with Joseph Stalin's efforts thwarted, we will see that he would back down, greatly humiliated because of this. But it demonstrates to us at this point that the Cold War could have turned hot. And we'll see that this won't be the last instance in the next couple of years to where the Cold War could potentially turn into a hot conflict or even World War III. Now, in the midst of the Berlin Airlift, I do want to point out that there will be a new organization that would be formed that the U.S. would become a part of, that of NATO. Now, when NATO is officially formed, basically the 12 powers that would agree to this program at first, they're going to agree that if one of them is attacked, they will all see that this is an attack and declare war against the Soviet Union. Now, with that in mind, we'll see the U.S. will be one of those nations that would join NATO, and this officially declares for the U.S. that isolationism was dead. Unlike after the end of World War I, America would continue to be involved in world affairs. However, as the U.S. continues to stay involved in world affairs, there will be points to where the Cold War could turn hot. And especially as America was focusing on what was occurring outside of Berlin, we'll see that there will be major developments within the Cold War that threatens to throw the favor into the communist powers' favor. And by the end of 1949, while the Berlin Airlift would be a massive failure for the Soviets, we'll see that there will be two other events that will take place that will drastically, perhaps, change the fortunes of the Soviets in the Cold War. The first is going to be the development of an atomic bomb within the Soviet Union. The Russians are going to detonate their first successful atomic bomb, and why this is so significant is because now, in regards to the arm race that was developing between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they were both on equal footing. No longer was the United States the only power that had access to the atomic bomb, and this ensured that the Russians could match the U.S. Pound for pound with this bomb. On top of that, that same year, shortly after the Russians detonate their first atomic bomb, we'll see that the nation of China will fall to communism. Mao Zedong and the communist forces would be successful in taking control of China in October of 1949, and why that's so significant is A, the Russians now get a significant ally with about 1 billion people living within its borders, but more importantly, China is going to dominate affairs out in Southeastern Asia and in Asia in general for the better course of the next half century. And we'll see because of this, communism will begin to slowly spread throughout Asia. And then the United States, as it had been focusing on Europe, it will then begin to turn its attention to Asia. First, with a conflict that threatens to turn this whole Cold War into a hot war when we see the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Now, the Korean War will break out in June of 1950. However, it was really a long time coming. At the end of World War II, after the Soviet Union declared war against Japan, this is really in the last couple of months of the conflict, by August of 1945, we'll see that the Soviets would enter the Korean Peninsula. They would take about half the country, and in response to this, we'll see that the United States would also send troops into the Korean Peninsula to stop the spread of communism there. They would meet at the 38th parallel, but moving forward, the Korean Peninsula would be divided into two halves, with communism in the north and capitalism in the south. And both of the powers that take charge in North and South Korea, they envision a day to where there would be a united Korean Peninsula under the respective cause. And so no surprise that this would eventually lead to the outbreak of the conflict when we'll see the North Korean army invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950. Now, the Korean War will be the first in a series of proxy wars, or smaller conflicts that would be fought as a part of the larger Cold War. And immediately we'll see that the United States will get involved in this conflict, as well as the newly formed United Nations, sending over hundreds of thousands of troops to hopefully save South Korea. By September of 1950, where South Korea was on the verge of collapse, with the timely arrival of a United Nations force under the command of Douglas MacArthur, after he launches an invasion just outside of Seoul, he will completely reverse the fortunes of the war and push the North Korean army back into North Korea. However, from here, MacArthur is going to look to capitalize on his gains, and by doing so, he will invade North Korea. Now, Harry Truman was reluctant to give this authority over to MacArthur, and he's going to give him the warning, do not upset the Chinese, who are just off the northern border north of the Yalu River that we see in North Korea. However, we'll see that Douglas MacArthur, his rhetoric will become ever more radical, and he'll also begin to bomb Chinese villages as he approaches the Yalu River. No surprise, China would enter the war in November of 1950, and where the Americans were on the verge of taking over the entirety of the Korean Peninsula, they'd be back where they had started at the beginning of all this. By January of 1951, Seoul had been recaptured by the communists, and it looks like perhaps the war will continue on for years to come. Now, the war will enter a stalemate, and the Allied powers would regain much of what we see within South Korea, but nonetheless, we'll see the Korean War will become increasingly unpopular as it drags on. People will begin to demand that Truman end the war, but it won't be until the Eisenhower administration that we see the Korean War officially come to an end. But this is only the first in a series of conflicts that the U.S. will get involved in the Cold War that we'll see develop out in Asia. But even up to this present day, with the end of the Korean War, we still see a divided Korea between North and South. Now, as we do see the emergence of the Korean War, I do want to take a moment to turn our attention back to see what was happening back in the United States as all this was unfolding. Because as the Cold War was looming large, we will see that it would have a tremendous impact on American policies. But also, I want to talk about how Truman is going to adjust the American economy in the midst of the post-war years. So for the last few minutes of this lecture, we're going to take a look at the Truman administration and his domestic policies in the early years of the Cold War. Now, turning back the clock to the beginning of the Truman administration, Harry Truman takes over the presidential office in April of 1945, which was just at the tail end of the Second World War. Now, the big issue that Truman's going to have to deal with is not only is how he's going to conduct the Cold War, but he's also going to have to deal with an issue back at home. The U.S. was beginning to transfer from being a wartime society to a peacetime society. And some of the things he's going to have to worry about is how he can transition American society back to peace. How can he avoid widespread unemployment? How can he ensure that Americans can continue to enjoy great benefits with their jobs and high wages and so forth? Well, this is where he's going to unveil his Fair Deal programs that will dominate his domestic policy within his administration. Basically, what the Fair Deal is he would call for a promotion of New Deal programs and their expansion. He would look to expand upon the welfare state, as well as perhaps even establish a health care system. On top of that, also part of his Fair Deal system, what he's going to promote is the issue of civil rights. We'll see with the Truman administration to push forth that issue, there was a renewed interest by the American public to push for civil rights. And we'll see that beginning with Truman, he would begin to desegregate not only the federal government, but also the U.S. military. However, really this push for civil rights is going to be rejected under the Truman administration, especially from members from his own party. Because remember, Truman was a part of the Democratic Party that relied on major Southern support. And we'll see that they will heavily oppose him throughout his administration with pushing forth these issues. And it will have to be up to a future president to get those policies pushed through Congress. And we'll talk about the developing civil rights movement as we move forward. In the meantime, as Truman wins one of the greatest upsets in presidential history by winning the election of 1948, he's going to have to deal with other issues as he takes office for a second presidential term. We talked about the fall of China to communism as well as the Korean War just a moment ago, but back at home we'll see with the spread of communism, this is going to create a second Red Scare. And we'll see that basically a witch hunt is going to happen within American society to where Americans are going to be accused of being communists, be arrested as a result of these accusations. Effectively, this period is going to develop an ideology known as McCarthyism. Now, McCarthyism was really going to center around the Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin, who's going to proclaim that he has a list that the federal government was infiltrated by suspected communists. This came after all the events that we had just talked about before. Many Americans feared that there were Soviet spies everywhere. And what will result is basically a witch hunt to where political careers would come to an end because people were being accused of being a communist. Now, eventually, this movement will spiral out of control, and when Joe McCarthy accuses George Marshall of being a communist, people are going to begin to realize that he was really just on a political witch hunt. All those that he would accuse, not one of them would be a communist, but nonetheless, the damage had been done. But it demonstrates to us how Americans were beginning to respond to the Cold War and how they believed communism was beginning to infiltrate their societies. But anyways, as McCarthyism begins to die out, we do see that the Truman administration would begin to come to a close. Now, Harry Truman himself, when he leaves office, he's going to have one of the lowest presidential approval ratings in history. Well, I should say the lowest. He's going to have a 25% approval rating when he leaves office. Now, historians have been much kinder to Harry Truman than his contemporaries, but when we do see Truman leave office, we'll see that the nation would be greatly changed. Not only are they dealing with this new conflict and a new type of conflict with the Cold War, but we'll see that the American society by the beginning of the 1950s, when he leaves office, is going to begin to flourish. We'll see wages will be high, jobs will be plentiful, and American society will prosper during the 1950s. But we'll talk about American society in the 1950s when we get to our video next time. But anyways, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up on that note. And just like always, make sure for this week that you complete all outstanding assignments, as well as watch all related videos to this topic, as well as read through the textbook chapter. But if you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe. I'll see everybody in the next video.